They built 29 houses, those vultures from the Homeowners Association, right on the edge of what they thought was just a pretty water feature. They didn't know, or perhaps didn't care, that my family had controlled the levels of that lake for 3 generations. And I wasn't about to let their greed ruin what was mine. So when the last nail was hammered and the sold signs went up, I calmly walked to the old spillway controls, just like my grandfather taught me, and began to turn the wheel. You see, some people think they can take whatever they want. I was about to teach them a very wet, very expensive lesson about the true meaning of water rights. My great-grandfather, a man with more foresight than an entire committee of modern city planners, acquired the valley and the natural spring that fed it back in the late 1920s. He wasn't a wealthy man by societal standards, but he was rich in practical knowledge and an understanding of the land. He saw the potential not for exploitation, but for creation, a sanctuary. He built the dam himself, with his own 2 hands, and the help of a few trusted friends, using local stone and ingenuity. It wasn't a colossal concrete monstrosity like you see in government projects, but an earth and rock-filled dam, artfully constructed, with a robust spillway system that allowed for precise control of the water level. He envisioned a private lake, a place for family, for reflection, for fishing, and a haven for local wildlife. And that's exactly what he created. My grandfather inherited it, maintained it, taught my father its secrets, and my father, in turn, passed that legacy and responsibility on to me. The deeds were ironclad, the water rights meticulously documented and registered with every relevant state and county authority, predating most of the zoning laws that would later tangle up the surrounding areas. The lake, its bed, the dam, and the exclusive rights to manage its water levels were, unequivocally, mine. For decades, our family were the quiet custodians of this beautiful, engineered ecosystem. We kept the water levels balanced, high enough for recreation and ecological health in the summer, a little lower in winter to accommodate snowmelt and heavy rains, always ensuring the dam's integrity. Local folks knew about Old Man Hemlock's Lake, as it was sometimes affectionately called after my great-grandfather, and they respected its private nature. Occasionally, a respectful neighbor might ask permission to fish, and if they were polite and understood the rules, catch and release, pack out everything, permission was sometimes granted. It was a harmonious existence. The nearest town was a sleepy little place back then, and development was slow, organic. No one dreamed of encroaching. The idea that someone would build houses so close that they could be lapped by its waters if I chose to raise it to its maximum legally permitted height seemed preposterous. The high water mark, clearly defined in our surveys, and visible in the vegetation line on older parts of the shore, was something we were always mindful of, but never had to aggressively assert. It just was. The lake breathed, and we helped it breathe correctly. My childhood was spent on its shores, learning to swim, to fish, to identify the calls of the birds that nested nearby. I knew every cove, every submerged log, the way the light hit the water at different times of day. It wasn't just property. It was a part of my soul, a living testament to my family's history and their connection to this land. The thought of it being commercialized or disrespected was anathema. I had all the original engineering plans for the dam, the hydrological studies my grandfather had commissioned in the 60s, when a small upstream development, nothing like what was to come, had occurred, and a healthy respect for the power I wielded. It wasn't a toy. It was a responsibility. The control mechanism for the main spillway gate was a beautiful piece of cast iron engineering, a large wheel that required significant, deliberate effort to turn, ensuring no accidental adjustments could be made. It was housed in a small, stone pump house, almost like a miniature fortress, guarding the lake's heart. The first sign of the impending storm, long before any actual water rose, came in the form of surveyors. Not our surveyors, but unfamiliar faces with flashy equipment trampling through the brush on the far side of the lake, an area that had always been a buffer of undeveloped woodland. I went over, polite but firm, to inquire. They were vague, mentioning a new residential project, and quickly packed up when I started asking about permits and whose land they thought they were on. That was when I first heard the name Pinnacle Pines HOA, a venture capital-backed development company with a reputation for aggressive tactics and cutting corners. They'd bought a large parcel of land that abutted my property on the eastern side, a stretch I'd always hoped would remain wild, or at least be developed with some respect for the local environment. Soon, glossy brochures started appearing in local stores, advertising luxury lakeside living at Pinnacle Pines. Lakeside, my lake. The maps in their promotional materials were cleverly distorted, making my private lake look like a community amenity, a shared pond almost, with little cartoon boats and happy families frolicking on its shores. There was no mention of private ownership, no indication that this lakeside was, in fact, entirely dependent on my goodwill. The first official communication I received wasn't a polite inquiry or a proposal for easement, but a demand letter. It was penned by a slick law firm informing me that Pinnacle Pines LLC, soon to be the Pinnacle Pines HOA, intended to make full and reasonable use of the adjacent waterway for recreational purposes for its residents, and would require unfettered access to the shoreline for boat launching and maintenance. They even suggested I might be liable if I unreasonably restricted this access. I laughed, but it was a humorless sound. I remember thinking, they can't be serious. My lawyer, a calm, seasoned man named Arthur who'd handled my family's affairs for years, reviewed the letter and chuckled too, but his was a more thoughtful sound. Well, he said, they're certainly ambitious, and utterly clueless about water rights, it seems. We drafted a polite but unequivocal response, enclosing copies of my deeds, the original water rights grants, and a clear map of my property lines, highlighting the fact that the entire lake, including its bed, up to the legally defined high water mark, was mine. We stated, very clearly, that no access would be granted, and any attempt to use the lake would be considered trespassing. We sent it certified mail, return receipt requested. The return receipt came back signed by someone named Brenda Scaife, who, I would soon learn, was the designated HOA president even before the first house was sold. Her title, I suspected, was mostly to give her an air of authority she hadn't earned and certainly didn't deserve. For a few weeks, there was silence. I almost hoped they'd seen reason. Then the bulldozers arrived. Not on my land, not yet, but close, too close. They started clearing trees right up to my property line, sending vibrations through the ground that I could feel in my own house. The noise was incessant. The dust coated everything. And Brenda Scaife herself made an appearance. She was a woman who seemed to be permanently pursed, as if smelling something foul, probably the scent of anyone who didn't immediately kowtow to her imagined authority. She drove a golf cart like a tiny electric chariot, often with a hard hat perched precariously on her impeccably coiffed hair, as if playing dress-up as a construction boss. She actually had the audacity to drive up to my gate one afternoon. "Mr. Hemlock," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "we need to discuss your unreasonable stance on the lake. Our residents are expecting waterfront amenities. It's in the brochures." I remember walking out and calmly informing her, "Ms. Scaife, it's not a waterfront amenity for your development. It's my private property, and as I've informed your company, no access will be granted." "Your brochures are misleading, and that's your problem, not mine," she sputtered, Something about community spirit and being a bad neighbor. I just reiterated my position. This conversation is over, Miss Scaife. Please stay off my property. She huffed, turned her golf cart around with a theatrical flourish, and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust and indignation. I knew then this was just the beginning. These people weren't just ambitious, they were deliberately obtuse, banking on their money and aggression to steamroll anyone who stood in their way. They underestimated me. They underestimated my connection to that land and that water, and the lengths I would go to protect it. The fight was truly on. The construction of the 29 homes began in earnest, a symphony of banging hammers, whining saws, and the incessant beeping of trucks backing up. They were erecting these houses at an astonishing speed. Flimsy-looking things with vinyl siding and oversized windows that all seemed to stare directly at my lake, like rows of greedy, vacant eyes. What became alarmingly clear was their proximity to the water. They weren't just near the lake, they were practically on its historical floodplain. I pulled out my great-grandfather's original survey maps, cross-referencing them with more recent county GIS data. The designated high water mark, the one legally mine and up to which I could raise the lake, lapped at where their foundations were being poured. It was shocking. Either their surveyors were catastrophically incompetent, or Pinnacle Pines had deliberately chosen to ignore the clear topographical realities and legal boundaries in a brazen gamble. Construction debris started appearing near my shoreline, discarded lumber, empty cement bags, plastic wrapping fluttering in the reeds. Their workers, often taking breaks, would wander onto my property to get closer to the water, sometimes even tossing their lunch wrappers into the lake itself. Each incident was photographed, documented, and a formal complaint lodged with Miss Scaife and Pinnacle Pines LLC, CC'd to Arthur. The responses, if they came at all, were dismissive. "We'll speak to our contractors," was a common refrain, but nothing ever changed. Then came the marketing. Oh, the marketing! Billboards went up on the main highway. "Pinnacle Pines, your lakeside dream awaits." Their website featured renderings of happy families kayaking and paddleboarding on my lake. They even had the gall to show a small community dock photoshopped onto my shoreline. This wasn't just encroachment. It was a deliberate misrepresentation, a theft of my property's primary attribute to lure unsuspecting buyers. Arthur fired off another round of cease and desist letters, this time threatening legal action for false advertising and property infringement. Their lawyers responded with bluster, claiming natural and appurtenant rights to adjacent water bodies. Legal jargon that sounded impressive, but, in our case, was utter nonsense given my explicit, deeded ownership. Brenda Scaife became more audacious. One Saturday morning, I found her, accompanied by two men who looked like they moonlighted as bouncers, on my side of the property line, near the old boat ramp my family used. She was pointing at the ramp and talking animatedly, gesturing towards the lake. I approached, my temper simmering. "Miss Scaife," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You are trespassing. Again." She jumped, startled, then puffed herself up. "Mr. Hemlock, we were just discussing the placement of the community canoe rack. Surely you can see the benefit of cooperating. It will enhance property values for everyone." I remember looking her dead in the eye. "There will be no community canoe rack. There will be no community access. This is private property. The next time I find you or your associates on my land without my express permission, I will have you arrested for trespassing. Is that clear enough for you?" Her face turned a delightful shade of puce. The two goons looked slightly less confident now. She stammered something about me being obstructive and unneighborly. Then they retreated, casting resentful glances over their shoulders. It was becoming a war of attrition. They were testing my resolve, hoping I'd give in, sell an easement, or just get tired of fighting. I spent hours poring over my documents, reading up on water law, and consulting with Arthur. He was invaluable, a rock of calm legal reason in a sea of their arrogance. We documented every single transgression, every piece of trash, every trespassing worker, every misleading advertisement, every hostile encounter with Scaife. The file grew thicker by the week. The stress was immense, a constant knot in my stomach. My peaceful sanctuary was under siege. But with the stress came a hardening resolve. They had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The sheer audacity of building those houses so low, so vulnerable to the lake's natural and legally permissible extent, was an act of either extreme stupidity or extreme arrogance. I was beginning to suspect it was a potent cocktail of both. They were counting on me, never exercising my full rights, perhaps thinking the environmental regulations or common decency would prevent me. They didn't understand that they had already trampled all over common decency, and my rights were established long before many of those modern regulations were even conceived. The aha moment, the one where the nebulous anger solidified into a concrete plan, came during a late-night review of my great-grandfather's original dam engineering specifications. Alongside the structural plans were detailed hydrological notes and calculations for the maximum safe water level, the absolute highest the lake could be brought without compromising the dam's integrity. A level established to handle a 100-year flood scenario, plus a safety margin. This level was clearly marked on all accompanying surveys, and, crucially, it was the level to which my water rights legally extended. I pulled out the recent satellite imagery I'd saved from the county GIS website, showing the footprint of the new Pinnacle Pines houses. Using the survey scale, I carefully compared the elevations. My blood ran cold, then hot. 29 of those brand new homes, some already sporting sold signs, were situated well below that maximum water line. Their foundations, their pristine new lawns, even the ground floors of several of them, would be inundated if I raised the lake to its full, legally permissible capacity. It wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It would be catastrophic for those structures. The HOA hadn't just built near my lake. They'd effectively built in my lake, or at least in its potential flood basin which I controlled. A grim satisfaction settled over me. They handed me the weapon to defeat them, gift-wrapped in their own incompetence and greed. My first call was to Arthur. I laid out what I'd found, the historical documents, the surveys, the dam specifications. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you absolutely certain about these figures, the elevations?" he asked, his voice tinged with a new kind of interest. I confirmed I was, and that I wanted him to triple-check every piece of documentation regarding my water rights and the dam's operational limits. "I want to know, beyond a shadow of a doubt," I told him, "that if I raise that lake to its documented maximum, I am 100% within my legal rights." He promised to dig into it immediately. Next, I contacted a retired civil engineer, a friend of my father's named George, who specialized in water resource management and dam safety. I didn't tell him my full intentions, not yet, but I asked him to do an independent review of the old dam plans and my proposed operation of the spillway to reach that maximum documented level. I wanted to ensure there was no unforeseen structural risk, no nuance of dam operation I might have overlooked. George, after a thorough review and a site visit where he examined the dam and spillway mechanism with a practiced eye, confirmed it. "She's an old girl, but she was built right," he said, patting the stone wall of the pump house. "Your great-granddad knew his stuff. The mechanism is sound. You can take her up to that design level without any issue, provided you do it slowly and monitor everything." He even gave me a schedule for incrementally closing the spillway gates to achieve a gradual, controlled rise, minimizing stress on the structure and the surrounding land. While Arthur and George were doing their due diligence, the Pinnacle Pines HOA was blissfully unaware, forging ahead with their sales. Brenda Scaife was often on site, beaming at prospective buyers, extolling the virtues of lakeside living. I watched from my property, a silent observer. As open house banners went up and moving, vans started to occasionally appear. Each new sold sign was like another nail in their own coffin. Arthur called back a week later. "You're clear," he said, a note of admiration in his voice. "The deeds, the water rights, the dam permits, they're all unassailable. Your right to control the water level up to that specified maximum is absolute and predates any of their development or current zoning. They built in a known flood path defined by your pre-existing rights. Their surveyors either missed it or ignored it. It's their folly." That was all I needed to hear. The final pieces of my plan clicked into place. I discreetly gathered some necessary supplies: new grease for the spillway gear mechanism, a heavy-duty wrench that fit the auxiliary lock nuts perfectly, and a set of powerful LED floodlights, just in case I needed to work at night, though I planned for a daytime operation. I spent an afternoon meticulously cleaning and lubricating the spillway wheel and its gearing. It turned smoothly, powerfully, under my hand. There was a profound, almost spiritual sense of purpose settling over me. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about restoring balance, about defending a legacy. The lake had been a source of peace and sustenance for my family for generations. Now, it would become an instrument of justice. The arrogance of the HOA, their relentless pressure, their dismissal of my rights, had pushed me to this. They were about to discover that some waters run very deep, and some property owners do not back down. The day I chose was a Tuesday, overcast and breezy, the kind of day that often precedes a good rain, which would provide a convenient, if ultimately unnecessary, bit of camouflage for the rising waters. Most of the 29 houses now had sold signs, and I'd seen a few moving trucks come and go over the past weeks, though most still appeared unoccupied or only sporadically visited. This felt like the optimal window, enough sales completed for maximum financial impact on Pinnacle Pines LLC and the nascent HOA, but before too many innocent families had fully moved in and unpacked their lives into a disaster zone. I felt a pang of something akin to regret for any uninvolved buyers who might get caught in the crossfire. But my primary responsibility was to my land, my legacy, and frankly, to teach a lesson that desperately needed learning. Due diligence is a buyer's responsibility too, especially when purchasing property adjacent to a privately controlled body of water. At precisely 9:00 a.m., after a final check of the spillway mechanism and a slow walk along my side of the lakeshore to ensure no unexpected people or animals were in the immediate vicinity of the dam, I entered the stone pump house. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of damp earth and old iron. The great wheel of the spillway control stood ready. I took a deep breath, grasped its cold rim, and began to turn. It was heavy, requiring deliberate, sustained effort, exactly as George had said it would. Each rotation closed the main gate by a precisely calibrated increment. I followed the schedule George had helped me devise: a quarter turn every 15 minutes for the first hour, then a half turn every 20 minutes. This was no sudden deluge, but a slow, inexorable strangulation of the lake's outflow. After setting the initial sequence, I emerged from the pump house and sat on a weathered stone bench overlooking the lake, a thermos of coffee in hand. From my vantage point, I could see the distant cluster of new houses on the far shore. Nothing seemed amiss over there yet, The lake's surface was vast, and it would take time for the change to become noticeable. Hours passed. I continued the adjustments, methodically, calmly. By early afternoon, the water level had risen by a couple of feet. It was subtle, but I, who knew every ripple and line of that lake, could see it. The familiar rocks near my little dock were disappearing. The water was creeping higher up the reedy banks. And then, across the lake, I saw the first sign of agitation. A man in a bright yellow construction vest, probably a site manager for Pinnacle Pines, was standing at the edge of what would have been a newly turfed lawn, gesticulating wildly towards the water. He was too far away to hear, but his body language screamed panic. He was soon joined by another, then another. I saw Brenda Scaife's golf cart zip erratically towards the growing crowd. The water, having swallowed the new turf, was now lapping at the concrete patios of the lowest-lying houses. It wasn't a crashing wave, but a silent, persistent creep, like a stain spreading. It kissed the decorative brickwork, then began to seep under doorways. My phone started ringing around 3:00 p.m. It was an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again and again. Then Arthur called. "They're losing their minds," he said, a hint of amusement in his professional tone. "I've just had a rather hysterical call from their legal counsel, accusing you of maliciously flooding their development." I calmly informed him that, to my knowledge, you were merely operating your dam within its long-standing, legally permitted parameters. He didn't seem to appreciate that. By late afternoon, as the sun began to dip, the scene across the lake was one of controlled chaos. Water was visibly pooling inside the ground floors of at least a dozen houses. Several newly paved driveways were submerged. I could see people rushing about, some trying futilely to move items, others just staring in disbelief. Brenda Scaife was now on the phone, pacing back and forth, her earlier arrogance replaced by a mask of frantic desperation. At around 5:00 p.m., a sheriff's deputy's car pulled up to my gate. I met him there. He was a young, polite officer. "Sir," he said, "we've had a report of you flooding the new houses over there." I nodded. "Officer, I own this lake and the dam that controls it. I have documentation going back nearly a century confirming my right to operate this lake up to its current level. The houses, unfortunately, appear to have been built within my legal flood easement." I offered him a folder containing copies of the key deeds and permits. He took it, looking skeptical but also intrigued. "This is unusual," he said, leafing through the documents. "I'm just here because of the complaint, as long as you're within your rights." "I assure you I am," I said calmly. "The developers were repeatedly warned." He looked across the water at the sorry scene, then back at my paperwork. "Well, Mr. Hemlock, this seems to be a civil matter, a very big one, by the looks of it. As long as there's no immediate threat to life or public safety from the dam itself, which there doesn't seem to be." He handed back the folder. "You might want to expect more visitors." He tipped his hat and left. The water had reached its predetermined maximum level. It sat, placidly, about 2 feet deep in the ground floors of the most poorly sited homes, rendering them uninhabitable. The grand lakeside development now looked like a marshland shantytown. My work, for now, was done. The lake was full, my rights asserted. The ensuing storm would be legal, not meteorological. The reckoning was swift, though not in the way the Pinnacle Pines HOA had hoped. The day after the Great Hemlock Deluge, as one local paper would later tongue-in-cheek dub it, their lawyers were frantically filing emergency injunctions, demanding I immediately lower the water level. Brenda Scaife, looking disheveled and far from her usual imperious self, was quoted in a rushed online news piece, calling me a menace and a neighborhood terrorist. The accusations were laughably impotent against the mountain of evidence Arthur and I had prepared. Our response to their legal filings was simple, a meticulously compiled brief that laid out, with surgical precision, my undeniable legal right to maintain the lake at its current level. We attached copies of the original deeds, the century-old water rights grants, the detailed dam specifications, historical survey maps clearly showing the high water mark, and even copies of our previous correspondence, warning Pinnacle Pines about their encroachment and misleading advertising. We highlighted that the homes were constructed in what was, effectively, my bathtub, and they'd been repeatedly told not to build there. The emergency hearing was a spectacle. Their legal team, a group of slick city lawyers who probably charged by the syllable, tried to argue equity and public good, claiming my actions were disproportionate and malicious. Arthur, calm and methodical, simply walked the judge through the timeline and the documentation. He pointed out that Pinnacle Pines LLC had proceeded with construction despite explicit warnings and clear evidence of my superior property rights. The public good, he argued, was not served by rewarding reckless development and a blatant disregard for established legal ownership. The judge, an old-school jurist known for his meticulous attention to property law, listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions that made the HOA's lawyers squirm. When Arthur presented the photos of their lakeside dream advertising, juxtaposed with maps showing my property lines completely encompassing the dream, you could see the judge's patience wearing thin. He also wasn't impressed by their last-minute attempts to claim my dam was suddenly unsafe or improperly operated, especially after George, my engineer friend, provided an affidavit confirming its soundness and my adherence to best practices in raising the water level. The critical blow for them came when Arthur introduced evidence of their own surveyor's initial report document we'd obtained through a surprising bit of whistleblowing from a disgruntled former employee of the surveying company. This report, which Pinnacle Pines had apparently tried to bury, clearly noted the potential conflict with my historical high water mark and recommended a more cautious setback for the buildings. They had ignored their own expert advice. The judge's ruling was a masterpiece of understated legal demolition. He denied their request for an injunction, stating flatly that I appeared to be operating entirely within my long-established legal rights, and that Pinnacle Pines had, to put it mildly, assumed a significant and foreseeable risk by building where they did despite ample warning. He essentially told them they'd made their watery bed and now they had to lie in it. The fallout for Pinnacle Pines and its nascent HOA was cataclysmic. The buyers of the flooded homes were, understandably, furious. Class action lawsuits began to pile up against the developers, citing misrepresentation, negligence, and failure to disclose material facts. Insurance companies, smelling a rat in the form of the ignored survey report, began denying claims or launching their own investigations into Pinnacle Pines' conduct. Brenda Scaife vanished from public view, her reign as the self-appointed queen of Pinnacle Pines, ending not with a bang, but with a gurgle. The development company's stock, if they had any publicly traded, would have plummeted. As it was, their venture capital backers were reportedly apoplectic. For weeks, the lake remained at its full level. The 29 houses sat in their artificial swamp, a potent symbol of greed and incompetence. Weeds began to grow in the stagnant water around them. Birds started to investigate the new, unintended wetlands. Eventually, under immense pressure from the county, who were now facing a potential environmental mess if the houses started to truly decay, and multiple lawsuits, Pinnacle Pines LLC declared bankruptcy. The unfinished parts of the development halted. The flooded homes were a total loss. Arthur and I negotiated a settlement. I agreed to gradually lower the lake level, not to its previous everyday operational height, but to a point that still left their lowest lots permanently waterlogged and undevelopable, a clear no-build zone. This was contingent on them funding the removal of the ruined structures and undertaking significant environmental remediation, all at their or their creditors' expense. It cost them millions. The satisfaction was immense, but it was a quiet satisfaction. My sanctuary was safe. The view across the lake was no longer marred by rows of poorly conceived houses, but by the slow process of nature reclaiming its own, aided by court-ordered demolition crews. The story became a local legend, a cautionary tale about respecting boundaries, both physical and legal. People learned that Old Man Hemlock's Lake was not to be trifled with, and that its current custodian was just as dedicated as his ancestors. Sometimes, when I walk by the pump house, I pat the old stone, a silent thanks to my great-grandfather's foresight. He knew the value of water, and he knew the importance of defending what's yours. I simply upheld his legacy. And if you're ever thinking of buying property next to a body of water, do your homework. Check the deeds. Check the water rights. Because you never know who holds the wheel that controls the flood. Drop a comment if you think they got what they deserved.